Let's talk about moving a persistent disk. Now, we can certainly move virtual machines, for example, from one zone to another or one region to another. And in this case, let's say we want to move from US East to US West. Now, if we have a persistent disk, we want to be aware that there's a few things we need to consider. For example, that persistent disk in this case is attached to this specific region. Now, this persistent disk, if we're going to move it, we want to make sure that it is not attached to more than one instance. So, for example, if it's a persistent disk, we can only have it attached to one instance. And if it's attached to two, then we're going to have to deattach it from this virtual machine. And basically, then we're able to consider moving this virtual machine here, this image with the persistent disk, over to this specific region and or zone. So with that said, that's really the sort of the main point that I want to point out when it comes to moving a persistent disk. There are a good amount of requirements that you do need to consider as well, such as, do you have GPUs? Do you have, for example, local SSD that might be attached as well? Now, a local SSD, we can't move because it is local, of course, to that virtual machine rack in the specific region and zone. If we do have a local SSD, what we want to consider is this. We need to consider, for example, that it is temp storage, first of all, and that I like to compare a local SSD as to a high-performing, basically, notepad with a blob marker. And basically, you're going to write really quick, and you're not going to save the paper after you write. And this is what a local SSD is really meant for. So because an SSD that's local is meant for temp storage, we're not going to be able to preserve that data. So if we're going to terminate the instance, we need to be aware of that. If we do, for some reason, want to preserve the local SSD data, then what we want to do is replicate it to basically the persistent disk. It doesn't have to be the persistent disk. It could also be another durable storage option as well. Now, again, we want to consider, again, a lot of different scenarios. Also, too, there is an API option that I probably want to point out here as well before I forget. And if we're going to move our virtual machines, then we could do this in the API with what is called move. I think it's uppercase in this case. Yeah, instances API, with the API, that is. But again, if we do that, then again, that's a good way to implement a move that's automatic. However, if there's a reason that we can't move the VM automatically, such as we have a local SSD attached, then we need to perform a manual move. So when we perform a manual move, we need to, of course, make sure that the VM is terminated. So we have the VM terminated. Another thing, too, if we're going to move between regions, another thing we want to consider is what subnetwork we're on as well. So we need to look at the networking. And we may need to, when we move from here to there, we may need to consider a different subnet. And another thing, too, is if the local SSD does have basically GPUs attached with the virtual machine, then there's a few things we got to consider as well, is to make sure, for example, if the GPUs are here in US East, but if we try to move them to US West, not every zone and region will support the GPUs, nor do they support maybe the same version as well. So we need to consider certainly a lot of things. The main thing I want to really point out again is if we do move a persistent disk, we need to prepare to move that disk. And again, pay attention to, does it have a local SSD? Can we use the move VM approach with the API called move instance? Just a few things to think about as well when we consider moving VMs.